Thank you for listening to Crossing Cultures. This is the first episode of our 5th season of this show. We will post new episodes of this season every other Friday, so stay tuned for more conversations on anthropology, gender identity, and more. Previously on Crossing Cultures, we've discussed topics such as race in the gospel, LGBTQ and Christianity, abortion, the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and more. So if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel on any podcast platform or on YouTube to get updates on new episodes and to catch up on our previous seasons. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram at crossing.cultures. And now, here's our first episode of Season 5 of Crossing Cultures titled Anthropology and Christianity, Part 1.
Hi, my name is Phil Metzger, and in 1992 I moved to Moscow, Russia. From there I lived in the beautiful Central European country of Hungary, where my family and I spent the next 20 years living, learning, and sharing about Jesus. Different foods, culture, and language, but underneath it all, we discovered the most amazing people. We learned that to share the gospel effectively, we had to adjust. We had to cross cultures. Now we're back in the U.S., and we're discovering that this country is a melting pot of culture. This show is committed to helping Christians connect to those who think, believe, and live differently than them. This is Crossing Cultures. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Crossing Cultures. I'm excited about this kind of new season. One of the things that gets me excited about it is that I have a new guest host. Every season, we've invited somebody to serve as like a host with me who has expertise and heart and passion in a particular area. And this season, I get to have my new friend, Brian Howell. How you doing,
Hello.
Brian?
I'm good. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I should kind of admit that I sort of horned my way in here. I was like, can I be your guest host? Because I was a guest and just an actual guest last year, 2020.
Right.
And it was such a great conversation. And then I went, of course, listened to a bunch more episodes. It was like, this is a great podcast. So yeah, coming back to try a little stint as a guest host with
you didn't
Phil
force yourself in here. No. I mean, I was like blown away. I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be, because those 2 episodes we did together on what is culture were so well received. So many people just loved it. I loved getting to do that. This is a passion for me. And I was so excited that you had reached out to say, let's continue to do this, because you bring so much to that table. And so I'm glad that you're going to be here, not only to host, but also, man, you bring so much that you can answer yourself and you can speak into. So I'm really glad about that. And you brought a great guest today. I'm really excited about this. You want to introduce our guest for the show?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of what I want to do is, of course, use some networks and some connections to bring in some even better people that are going to help us with this. And the first person, of course, that came to mind was my co-author who helped me write the textbook that got me on your radar, Phil. And this is Jenelle Paris. She's a professor of anthropology at Messiah University and has been a good friend for a long time. We've overlapped in the anthropology world. And I know that everybody listening is going to really enjoy hearing from her. So welcome, Jenelle.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first podcast. I've never been on a podcast.
What?
No, and I asked my teenager what I should do. I said, should I be loud? Should I be silly? Should I be funny? And he said, Mom, don't try to be funny. So
Don't you just love kids?
I'll keep the humor in check.
All right. Well, if you start to get funny, we will stop you.
Yeah.
We were like, no.
Yeah.
Cannot go there.
On behalf of your teenager, we'll stop you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's only about 4 other people left who haven't been on a podcast. So I'm glad we got you in before them. So
yeah, we're pretty lucky. And I mean, I'm really surprised because I think that, and I was looking at, you've got several books. I mean, I'm highlighting kind of one that I had the privilege of reading for my own schooling, but you've got several books and such a wide range of thought that you bring to the table. And so I'm really glad. I think there's going to be a lot to get to talk about this in this hour.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, the book that we're talking about is Introducing Cultural Anthropology, and it's called A Christian Perspective. So maybe I can just start with this. Maybe it's good if you could just give us a definition of what is cultural anthropology And then maybe the preface to that would also be, or maybe the addendum to that would be this: why a Christian perspective? Why was there a need for there to be a Christian perspective? If cultural anthropology is just cultural anthropology, why did you guys feel the need to put that? And I guess I'm kind of, I'm looking at you, Jenelle, but of course, Brian, you guys wrote this together, so feel free to jump in there. Or Brian, if you have a better way to phrase that question, feel free.
No, I think it's a great question to start with. I know that I can say that Jenelle and I, one of the reasons we wanted to write this is that there wasn't a book on the market. And so there was a space for this, but also both of us had been teaching cultural anthropology and had run into lots of people who had either not encountered the discipline or had only a vague understanding or had it in a pretty small niche of terms of what it could be for the church. And both Jenelle and I think, had a vision for how anthropology could speak to a lot more than just missions, a lot more than just the sort of obvious cross-cultural stuff. And one of the reasons that I reached out to Jenelle specifically was, as you mentioned, she's done a lot of things in urban studies, in family issues, in gender studies. I mean, she's really looked at a lot of things that are of wide interest to the church. And I think this is one of the exciting things about anthropology, is that it has that reach. So yeah, let me kick it over to you, Jenelle, and just talk about maybe what drew you to the project when we first started talking about it, and some of the ways that you see anthropology as being relevant to the church today.
Well, anthropology is a vast discipline. I mean, it's not just Indiana Jones, but it does kind of include Indiana Jones. It's cultural linguistics, archaeology, forensics. It's very, very broad. And Brian and I are expert in cultural anthropology, which is the part of anthropology that looks at different cultures of the world. And that doesn't immediately sound like you have to have a Christian perspective on that.
Right.
But God is one and truth is one, but human cultures are many. And that's, I think, why we need a Christian approach. If we look at lots of different perspectives and take them seriously, can we still believe that there's one truth and one God? So I think Christians come to the field hungry for learning about the whole world, not just from a missions perspective, but for traveling and for just life in a diverse society. But there's a wariness or a worry there. And we wanted to address that head on and be sort of guides to people to come into a field that asks some really hard questions and to say, we can do this together as Christians and it'll be okay.
I think you guys both did that. I think you accomplished the goal you set out for sure. I mean, you had with me, you had and it's probably a lot of people that read it, we're already so excited about the topic. And so it was just the way you guys both framed it was very easy. And I mean that as a compliment. Like, it was easy to follow your thought process, your train of thought. It really moved well. I was curious on that though. How would you define cultural anthropology? Like, how would you guys define that for, maybe I think a lot of people listening to this are not in this field. I'm doing this. The whole point of the podcast is to try to connect to an American kind of audience who doesn't realize that they're doing missions or cultural anthropology every single day, in the sense that we're connecting to people who are different than us. We're connecting to people who maybe they believe differently, or they live differently, or their language is different, and learning how and understanding the value of cultural anthropology might be the difference between making a connection, making a friend of a neighbor, rather than constantly seeing them as an outsider. So how would you, in kind of layman's terms, define cultural anthropology?
I think there's two extremes. We could say, oh, people, they're kind of all the same wherever you go. And we could just say we're pretty much the same. But on the other extreme, we could say people are so different, we can't even relate. So when we only look at sameness, or we only look at difference, I think we're missing out. There's a middle range there where we are really different one from another in different cultures, but we share some things in common as humans. Cultural anthropology is about that sort of sharedness in human experience. How can we be all the same? We're born, we die, we love our families everywhere, but we speak different languages and we look at the world in different ways with different norms and values. And so cultural anthropology is just right there in the midst of that sameness and difference in the human experience.
We'll get back to our conversation on cultural anthropology in a moment. But before we do, we wanted to share a clip from a previous season of Crossing Cultures. This clip is titled The Dangers of Walled Off Cultures and features Phil and his co-host Nick Roach. Check it out.
There's the idea within like cultural, education and interculturalism, something I'm very passionate about. There's the idea of like, there's deep culture. In other words, things that like I just take for granted that obviously you believe this because I believe this because I've always known this is the way it is. And this is where we see a lot of clashes coming in. These deep worldview perspectives where it's like, no, this is the way, when I'm sick, this is how my mom takes care of me. Isn't that how your mom, took care of you? And sure. But I love what you're saying, and I want to maybe even ask you the question while we're talking about this is like, there's areas that can change.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
that we have a responsibility to change those things. Now, I can't necessarily change the whole culture,
right.
but I can change my culture in that.
Yeah, that's good. I think basically the thought is that, a cultural identity essentially develops, the culture that we're talking about develops out of the most frequent behaviors
right.
of the members, and so if the people inside that culture are doing things a certain way, like you're saying, for a certain amount of time, it just becomes almost like a traditional, that's what a tradition is. It's the way we do it this way because it started here and it probably has some emotional significance to the group. So that becomes the accepted pattern,
yep.
But as times change, we need to adjust our cultures so that the identity of the culture can still come through, but fit the context,
right?
The new context,
Right. And with that is learning how to accept the fact that not everybody shares my same cultural
right.
understanding,
which is
fine. Allowed. And then now how do because what happens is I build walls rather than bridges. And I think that's the main point of this whole podcast is that we want to build bridges between cultural perspective rather than a wall of like, well, that's your view and this is my view and you stay to your side, I'll stay to my side. Right. How do we bridge that gap? Not so that we both agree, but that we agree that we can respect each other. And of course, you and I share so much in common, but there's a lot of people out there that we would say, I don't agree with them, but I respect that they have a view and I can love that person for who they are.
And I would say to your point too about this idea of like cultures where maybe there's like friction,
right.
Between one cultural perspective and the other. I would say that could be a red flag for either side or both sides of understanding, okay, cultures when they're thriving, they're able to, they don't get diluted when they interact with other cultures.
Right.
You see what I mean? Like a thriving culture isn't threatened by, an infiltration of another group or by being watered down or anything. They come alive when they're in a diverse group because they're expressing their uniqueness. And they can appreciate everybody else's uniqueness in that harmony. And so I think that we can get a sense that maybe it is time to think about how we've been doing things. If everybody around me or certain people around me make me feel like I need to protect everything I have with whatever it is, isolation.
That defensiveness says something about me.
Exactly.
That clip came from Season 1, Episode 2 of Crossing Cultures titled The Art of Listening. You can catch up on previous episodes of Crossing Cultures on any podcast platform and on YouTube. And now, back to the show.
One of the topics that anthropology led me to, cultural anthropology led me to, was thinking about short-term missions. And I know that, Phil, you've seen some of my stuff on this. And oftentimes the takeaway from short-term missions, when you spend 2 weeks in another place, you hit the ground and you are sort of overwhelmed by difference. Oftentimes there's a different language, there's new foods, all sorts of new things, right? But at the end of 2 weeks, especially if you're hanging out with other Christians in that country, you start to feel this strong sense of connection, and you start to think, oh, we're singing the same songs, and they're just in different languages, and oh, we all love the Lord. And sometimes the takeaway after that, only just that short amount of time, is culture actually doesn't matter. We are actually all the same. And people kind of come home and they think, we're just all Christians and it doesn't matter. But when those same people stay maybe 2 months, 3 months, a year, then they start to kind of like, oh, yeah, culture matters. Like we do have a lot of things in common. We are the same. We are human beings, created in the image of God. but woo, these people are different than me, or I drive them crazy a little bit, they drive me crazy a little bit. So there's all these differences. But I'm so aware of, like, when we're having this conversation, that the term cultural anthropology can be kind of off-putting, or can be kind of daunting, because it sounds. I had a student once who said he signed up for cultural anthropology because it sounded so collegey. So it's like, I don't know what it is, but it just
Yeah,
sounds really
it's
complicated.
collegey. Yeah, yeah.
Collegey, right? So I don't want anybody to be, in any way put off by the language of cultural anthropology. So Jenelle, what would you say? What's the value of kind of understanding the discipline as a discipline? Like, is there some point that to telling people, like, yeah, it's worth kind of getting through some of the particular language of this discipline, or actually studying this thing called cultural anthropology?
Right. It's a mouthful to say. That's a lot of syllables, cultural anthropology. And most people who earn degrees, even at the master's and PhD level, that's not their job title. Anthropology is just so useful. It's useful in marketing, it's useful in business, certainly in public health, medicine. So often anthropology is just put to work and people don't necessarily notice that's what it is. So what Brian's asking, what use is it as a discipline? It just has a beautiful 150-year story of theory and philosophy about what it is to be human, not in a esoteric sense, but like, what is it to be human in this world, in a context, in a time and place? And then we have these amazing methods, or like techniques that we use for learning about what it is to be human. We use participant observation, we interview, we do surveys, we make maps, we learn languages. And so within the field, I think it's just wonderful ways of learning and reflecting on what it is to be human. And for Christians, we do this theologically and biblically. And what Anthro brings is this ability to think more deeply incarnationally, right? About what it is in this context, this time and place where God has placed us to be human.
Jenelle, you and I both share a little bit in the textbook about some of our own experiences, with these methods. Could you share some of the early, maybe, encounters with these methods that you had? I know it was in DC when you were doing your field work. Could you give us some of your moments of like, oh, I'm really learning something here. Like, this is really working.
Well, even earlier than DC, when I was an undergraduate, I went to Amsterdam with one of my anthropology professors, and we lived at a Youth with a Mission at a YWAM facility, and we were studying church planting efforts. And so we went to a neighborhood and we were trying to understand the unique characteristics of this neighborhood and the small churches that were there, how they worked. And then we were going to give that feedback to church planners so that they could better contextualize and understand this one neighborhood. And that all sounded really good. So my professor sent me to a train station and he said, I want you to count the people that come and go off the train. And I sat in this train station for a couple of hours. And the conclusion was 8 people walked through this train station. So he said, boy, that was a disastrous use of anthropological methods.
It was a bust.
That one was a bust. But I came away from it loving anthropology.
Wow.
People walking around neighborhoods, drawing maps of streets and trying to understand how the built environment shaped people's lives. And even, failed attempts, like wasting time and having nothing happen. I mean, that's how real life works. It's not all high drama. I came away from that fieldwork thinking, this is such a great way to learn. I don't want to only be in a library or only studying statistics. And so that was an early experience as an undergrad that led me to want to be an anthropologist. What about you, Brian? Did you have any very first fieldwork?
Yeah, I can also go back to my undergraduate days, which is where I ended up doing my first long-term fieldwork, which was in the Philippines. But I had to write a thesis, and I knew I didn't want to just sit in an archive. My advisor was a historian, so you'd think that going to the archive, but I was like, no, I want to talk to actual people. And the topic I was interested in was missions, but specifically how conversion interacted with people's cultural lives and the sorts of changes that came about in their cultural lives as they became Christians. But the only missionary I knew was this guy in the Philippines that our Methodist church supported. And so I called him up and got the time zone all wrong and woke him up in the middle of the night and was like, hey, can I come visit you? And he was like, okay. And I just hopped on a plane and landed in the Philippines, and he sent people to meet me. And it was craziness. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't even know I was doing anthropology. I hadn't taken an anthropology class at that point, but it was field work. It was listening to people. It was sitting around the fire with them at night. It was, learning to butcher a pig with them. It was, learning the dances where you just have a little piece of fabric wrapped around your middle and that's it. And, it was all of that, like realizing that only by being there and by actually participating in these things, that simply hearing people talk about them never would have given me the kinds of understanding that I was able to walk away with, even in that short time, even without a ton of training. It was so much better when I was able to go back with a better understanding of what I was doing. But even then, I think I was like you, I was kind of getting hooked on like, oh yeah, people, that's where this is at.
And having a reason to immerse yourself in other people's contexts and other people's lives and trying to understand it from within their shoes as much as you can. Just what a gift that anthropology gives us a reason to do that.
I think both of you.
I have another story, Brian.
Oh, you do?
As an undergraduate, I wanted to know why people suffer. So I was thinking about theodicy.
That's a big one.
My senior thesis was I thought homelessness. I thought homeless people must suffer.
Wow.
And so I spent a semester at a homeless shelter interviewing people, hanging out, spending time and trying to get a feel for their context and their lives. And then that was my senior thesis, was their description of when life is hard, what's that like and why?
Wow.
I loved it. It shaped me profoundly.
Are you guys both discovering, because I just think of like the times that we're living in right now, it's so much, there's either this like massive division over just people unable to understand that there has to be a little bit of effort put into connecting to other human beings, especially who maybe look a little different than you. It doesn't matter. We all live in the same country. They come from a different cultural background. They eat different foods than you're used to. Are you guys finding that so much of what you've discovered in years of not just research, but passion and interest and in what you've been teaching, are you seeing that being, I know the answer is yes, that is it relevant? I know that's the answer, but how relevant has this been in these last couple of years that you guys have been teaching young people about cultural anthropology?
Yeah, you want to talk about what you've encountered recently, Jenelle, in the classroom?
Well, fieldwork is so powerful because fieldwork is real, like really talk to people, really go spend time with them. And I think it's one of the challenges in divisions in America today is that we're consuming media about each other. That's not the same as being with each other.
Wow.
And so trying to use anthropology as a tool for being in a real time and place and discovering a capacity to connect and to talk to any fellow human being. And often over the kinds of divisions in America that just seem so extreme, they are real and they are extreme. But sometimes when we actually communicate face to face in a community or with an individual, we can find or maybe make some bridges of connection that we didn't think could be there.
In March 2022, our church was involved in helping Ukrainian refugees cross the borders of Ukraine as well as the border of Mexico and San Diego. We highlighted these efforts in our previous season of Crossing Cultures. Take a look.
We're recording this for season 4, if you can believe it, of Crossing Cultures. I think something that we're constantly trying to remind people is that really war began like 8 years ago. That was, after Maidan and then the annexation of Crimea.
This morning, ABC News cameras captured brutal scenes. Protesters gunned down by security forces.
We are not terrorists. We are free people that want to live in a good country without corruption. with good laws.
They basically tried to start the civil war inside Ukraine, but everybody knew that it's Russia.
Overnight, in the capital of Ukraine, the sound of missile strikes and air sirens.
We've been able to acquire a couple vans to go in and get people out.
It's scary, like there is a terror that grips you that is, it's hard to explain.
Crossing Cultures, Ukrainian Refugee Crisis. All episodes of Season 4 are available now on any podcast platform and on YouTube. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, I love this conversation about connection because I'm hopefully coming out of a time of, radical disconnection of, my son was a senior in high school last year, and he got none of the rituals of, advancement, of completion, of moving on. Like none of that happened. Kind of, we kind of had a graduation out on the football field, but it was weird and didn't feel right. And none of the parties and all the things that we have in American life to like signal, okay, one thing has ended, the next thing is beginning. And people experience that everywhere, in work, in family life, all over the place. So I find that like students are kind of coming into the classroom a little like out of practice or a little afraid, a little wounded, like we've all been hurt by this thing. And, so I have to be kind of gentle as I'm bringing students into this, but at the same time, I think they're really hungry for it. I think they're really excited about it. I think it's really important. I feel the importance of what I'm doing a little more than I ever have because they're coming in so kind of hurt by this pandemic. And that's just at the heart of it. The three big things, and I get this from a guy named Michael Wesch, who's an anthropologist at Kansas State University. The three big things of anthropology are asking questions, making connections, and trying new things. And it just kind of goes in that order. And if we can think of the questions that we want to know, and this I think helps to overcome division, because often we just don't even believe each other anymore. We don't believe like whatever they're saying isn't true, but if you ask questions, you have to want to have an answer. And then as you get the answers, you start making connections. And then as you start making connections, it sort of opens you up to new things and to think new things, try new things, get to know new people. And boy, I just think we sure need that right now more than ever.
I almost think like, even when you said that, Brian, I was just thinking about that, like asking questions. I feel like so many people are asking questions, but it's that like, I'm asking so that I can just say something really quick. I'm not actually listening to those questions. And I love what you guys are both saying about the importance of human connection. I know when I read your book, I was like, why didn't I have this before I spent 22 years on the mission field in Budapest, Hungary. And I was like, man, I wish I would have read this before. That would have been so helpful. But I came from a church tradition that really didn't emphasize education, really the opposite of encouraging education. And obviously I'm thankful for how God led me in my life. And I went back to get my education, but I just realized how much value there would have been. And I have such a heart to try to see these two worlds kind of blend together. I think there's we have so much to learn. Those of us that want to be the practitioners out on the mission field, there's so much to learn, but there's a lot of, I don't know why, but it seems like not enough people who go into mission work are studying cultural anthropology or anthropology, who actually do not just sociological research, but actually church planting and so on and so forth. Do you guys see that in with the students that you're working with, or are you seeing a new breed of young people that want to go out and be missionaries?
I see a broad range of Christian service.
That's great.
It may be less of a strict division between being a missionary or having a job in America. But a vision for whatever my job is, it should express Christian service. And that might not even be through the church or in an explicitly Christian way, but in any field, what is it about my faith that motivates and shapes the service that I bring to humanity or to society? I certainly see a change over time in that students are just immediately aware that their society, that the world has come to us, that they don't need to travel to a different place to encounter diversity, but the whole world through globalization has come to us. And so however they serve, they will be engaging people from different places, and people who might experience them and their personality and their way of being in different ways. So I think people are more, we don't have to convince them that diversity matters or that globalization is real. They certainly come knowing that and are prepared to learn some skills to live in that context.
I find one thing, as you're saying, Phil, about how you come from a tradition that didn't necessarily value formal education, it's something like 30 years ago, Mark Knoll published The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which was this, really important historical study of a kind of anti-intellectualism that has gone through American Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity. He's actually publishing a 30-year updated version of that. So it's going to be very interesting. I saw a pre-publication copy. A friend of mine had it, and it's coming soon. But I don't think that I encounter sort of anti-intellectualism as much, or sort of an anti-schooling much, as I encounter a very practical aspect, where students really want it to just be immediately applicable. And sometimes they don't see how cultural anthropology does that. I mean, once they get into it, and like Jenelle said, and they realize, oh, this is really going to help me in any circumstance where there's any kind of diversity, this is going to be helpful. But when they see it in the course catalog, or they kind of think about, what am I going to take, or what should I do with my time, they don't often think of something like cultural anthropology being practical or relevant to what it is that they want to do. I'm making air quotes for those who are just listening to me, by the way. But I want to do some work for my students, right, of helping them see how this is practical and how this really will show up in their daily lives. But I also want to challenge them that there are things that are worth sort of stretching themselves into. They may not know how God's going to use this in the future. They may not have an idea of how this is going to show up in their job, but it will absolutely. I guarantee them that if they try to think anthropologically about the world, that in their family relationships, in their church life, in their in whatever profession they find themselves in, whether it's paid or volunteer or however their lives unfold, that thinking anthropologically is going to do something. It's going to show up in some way. At least it's certainly been true in my life, and I haven't yet had a student come back and say, I've never thought anthropologically after I graduated. Like, they always are like, oh yeah, it connects in all these different ways that's showing up all the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And because again, to me, but again, it's been my life, it's my world, has been mission. So it's like, how is this not relevant? But I get it. Everybody's got their thing. But I'm thinking about it in this context of today, especially like the younger people who I love and value so much. I think they're going to do great things for the Lord in secular fields, in religious fields. It doesn't matter. Formal training, out there doing whatever. I have a lot of hope for this next group. But I'm wondering, from your guys' perspective, how do you help them to see, to the point that you just made, Brian, how do you help people see the immediate need for better understanding in these areas? Because you guys have learned the skill of neutrality. I mean, like, you guys are literally like experts. I feel like that's one thing I walked away with from so many of the anthropology books that I read. You really become an expert in like how to try to stay as neutral as possible, to learn to not allow yourself a bias that is going to do more damage to what you're trying to study. How do you help people today to stay neutral, maybe not in some field in Papua New Guinea, but in Chicago or Pennsylvania or California? How do you help them with that?
Yeah, interesting. Neutrality. I don't know that we would shape it. We would call it neutral. How would you talk about that, Jenelle? What would be the way you'd frame that?
Well, Brian, the word that we have for that in anthropology is not really helpful with Christians, but the word is cultural relativism. And relativism is not a helpful word. And it's one of the fears that Christians have when they come to anthropology, that they will become moral or ethical relativists. I mean, I don't know. And simply what cultural relativism means is trying to look at other people or other cultures relative to themselves. Don't just judge them or understand them from your point of view. And so there is a sense in which I suspend or hold lightly my assumptions or judgments so that I can really understand someone else. I don't know an anthropologist who practices ethical or moral relativism. Anthropologists work with the marginalized, the repressed, the victims, and they don't come away saying, well, who can say whether or not genocide is right or wrong? We do wrestle with how is it that we come to judgments, and are we doing that fairly or not? We wrestle with that constantly, but we're not neutral about, especially about human suffering. So, I mean, I sometimes use pedophiles as an example. I was so because it's an abhorrent group, and it's not a culture, it's individuals. But if all we do is judge and say you're bad, you're abhorrent, we won't come to understand how they see the world and why they do what they do. If we could hold our judgment lightly and say, help me understand how you see the world, help me understand your motivations, and with true human sympathy, come to understand. With that understanding, you can then make change. And you could not have made those changes had you only remained in your place of judgment.
Wow.
It is a deep and it's a profound practice, learning to suspend judgment for the sake of understanding the other. And it's useful in it's useful interpersonally, not just culturally.
Yeah, the practicing cultural relativism is an understanding. We want to understand what these things mean, how people experience them, what the significance is for them. And the only way to do that is to put it in relationship with everything else that is going on in that cultural context. But as an anthropologist, I'm never neutral in the sense of like not having a feeling or not having a response or not having a point of view, right? Like I always have those, but it becomes bias. I try to get my students to distinguish between bias and perspective, because bias, typically we use that in the term of a kind of negative judgment or a kind of blind prejudice that we're not really kind of aware of or we don't see a problem with. Whereas perspective is just, I am a very specific person, you know, and I've had very specific life experiences, and that's going to shape how I understand anything. So even when I'm engaging in this cultural relativism, I can actually learn something when I'm sort of paying attention to my own responses, my own feelings, my own, you know, the judgments that I do come to and the ways, then I can sort of say, why did I do that? Why did I think that? And this is we have a term for this, as we always do in anthropology, a term for everything. This is called reflexivity, where we are sort of questioning our own like formation and like, who am I and what do I think? But we don't have to give it up. We don't have to give up, because you can't, right? You can't give up your own perspective, and you don't need to give up your own moral convictions and your own personal convictions about what's right and wrong in order to, as Jenelle was saying, even something as abhorrent as, you know, pedophilia or, you know, infanticide, or, you know, there's a number of practices that exist, either because of individual psychology or because of, you know, cultural norms, that we can very comfortably say, no, that's a bad thing. But just saying it's a bad thing isn't going to help us understand it, and it isn't going to help us do something about it. If that's our goal, if our goal is to actually be involved in God's redemption in the world, then we need some pretty deep understanding so that we can figure out, well, what does God call us to do here?
In my own context, you know, I'd spent, you know, like I said, decades of just trying to connect to people who obviously we didn't share the language, we didn't share culture. And then, you know, when you're talking about a post-Soviet country, there's a very different morality, and my own journey of understanding people brought me to this is what I've loved so much about what I learned through you guys and your book and through, you know, different readings and journals, is I learned so much about myself in the process of learning about other people that was just so incredibly valuable, because my goal and hope was that they would know Christ. It was to bring the gospel, but just to discover the words alone, the message alone, it never makes any sense until you dive into understanding. And I guess that's where, for me, I've just valued so much. And I love what you're both saying about this, because you take the worst thing like you did, pedophilia, or one of the worst things, and you say, yeah, but does the Lord still want to redeem that human being that's in front of me? And if he does, then how am I going to ever reach them if they're never going to hear a word I say if they've already made up their mind about me. And I just see so much the value to that. And it seems to me like in many ways, I think you guys are, and I think that the whole field of cultural anthropology is kind of a prophets for today in many ways, in helping people just right now in the world they're in, not to go overseas to be a missionary, but just how to connect to human beings today. I think you guys have a real, if I could use the phrase, like a prophetic role to help people to see that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope we have a prophetic role, because I think that that's one of the things that anthropology can bring in is a new way of looking at something that has been kind of taken for granted. And if you look at the Old Testament prophets, New Testament prophets for that matter, and what they're about helping God's people to see what's going on in front of them in a way that they weren't seeing it. We have a phrase in anthropology of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So these things that we've become used to, so say in the Old Testament, they've become used to just incorporating whatever God worship, was kind of around them and just kind of joining in or whatever people were up to. And then God's, prophets coming in and saying, you're not looking at this right. You're not seeing the ways that this is hurting you. And you're not seeing the ways that God is, offended by this and that it's against his law. And not that anthropology wants to be all about, wagging fingers and yelling at people all the time, but to help people see things in new ways, I think is a big part of what we're about.
Yeah, I think prophecy is not just foretelling the future. It's perceiving and announcing what is real, that what is real in and how people might have misperceived the real. Honestly, I think anthropology is a wonderful, has maybe prophetic potential, but I think we could all be called to that. Do we love what's true? Do we love what's real? And do we want to know what's true and what's real? And where might God be in the world? And are we hungry for that? And do we seek after that? I think there's many ways we can do that.
Thank you for listening to Crossing Cultures. Subscribe to our show on YouTube or any podcast platform to receive notifications of when new episodes are released. We also have previous seasons with loads of discussions on topics like race in the gospel, Ukrainian refugee crisis, and more. Follow us and look back on what God has been doing in previous seasons. This episode with Dr. Brian Howell and Jenelle Williams Paris will continue with part 2 of Anthropology and Christianity. I'm your host, Keya Lopez, and I will see you next time on Crossing Cultures.